Awesome. Okay. Hey, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. For those of you I don't know, my name is Danny Zaki. I'm an organizer with the San Francisco Bay chapter of Sierra Club. The presentation tonight is part of our 3-part project. After tonight's webinar, you will receive an email with an instruction packet on how to do the rest of the project. The next part being photographing the king tides. In that project packet, you will find a map, some of our locations of interest, a guide on how to take photos of the tides, and instructions on how to submit your photos to the local project and also to the California Coastal Commission statewide project. This project is a part of Sierra Club's Bay Alive program, and it would not be possible without our partners at the California Coastal Commission, San Francisco Baykeeper, Richmond Shoreline Alliance, the Watershed Project, Green Action, and many, many more. Thank you all for your help and dedication. Each speaker tonight will give their presentation and at the end have a short question and answer period. Please feel free to keep your put your questions in the chat, and we will try to get to as many as we have time for. We probably won't get to every question tonight, so if you have lingering questions after the webinar, please feel free to go ahead and shoot me an email and I'll try to find that answer for you, and I'll put my email in the chat. And with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker of the night. Our first speaker is going to be Annie Kohut Frankel from the California Coastal Commission. Annie is the Grants and Education Programs Manager at the California Coastal Commission, where she's worked since 2001, creating curricula and student programs, managing the Commission's education grants, and heading up the California King's Tide Project. And Annie, I'm going to go ahead and spotlight you, and feel free to share your presentation.
Great, thank you. Let's see if I can get this to work right. Does that look okay, Danny? Is that good?
We are seeing the notes on this side.
You're seeing notes. Okay. Let me try that again. I'm going to start my slides. And how's that?
That's perfect.
Great, thank you. So I really appreciate all of you taking time out of your evening today and for your interest in this project. The California King Tides Project is part of an international effort asking people to safely photograph the shoreline during the highest tides of the year. Photographing the impact of these tides on beaches, wetlands, cultural sites, roads, and other coastal infrastructure helps California plan for future sea level rise in order to protect the people and the places that are important to us. So king tides is not a scientific term, but rather it's a catchy phrase that was coined in Australia to describe the highest high tides of the year. And those happen when the sun, the moon, and the earth are all in alignment, and the earth is just a little bit closer than usual to those other two bodies. That results in extreme high tides, and then we also see extreme low tides on those same days. So king tides, they're natural, they're predictable, but they are special. They're not an everyday occurrence. And king tides are a foot or so, 1 to 2 feet higher than the average high tide that we see throughout the year. And that's a good approximation of how high we expect everyday tides to be over the next few decades due to human-caused sea level rise. So king tides photos help us document current flood risk to better understand what's vulnerable right now. And they help us visualize the impacts of future sea level rise because of that correlation between how much higher they are and what we're expecting to come in the near future. They also help researchers and scientists ground truth and validate their climate change models to understand if what they're modeling is really what's occurring in the real world. And really important, they get us talking about climate change. So this future sea level rise that I'm referencing is a result of climate change. So I would like to take a quick step back for a moment to make sure that we all have a baseline understanding about what's causing climate change and the resulting sea level rise. And I'm sure that for some of you, this will be a refresher. When we burn fossil fuels, like coal, oil, and gas, we release rampant amounts of carbon dioxide. And that acts like a heat trapping blanket around the earth. As we burn more and more fossil fuels, we're thickening that blanket, heating up our air, our land, and our water. So some of the sea level rise that we're seeing is because when water gets warmer, it takes up more space. That's just a property of water. Another reason is that as our planet warms, glaciers and ice sheets are melting into the ocean, adding more water, raising the sea level. So the amount of sea level rise that we ultimately see will depend on how fast we stop burning those fossil fuels. This is my only graph, but it shows you those two contributors to sea level rise over the last couple of decades. This is average global sea level rise. Local sea level rise can vary because of factors like land that's rising because of seismic activity, or land that's rising because ground that was previously compressed by ice age glaciers is still rebounding after those glaciers melted. Or it can be land that's sinking because of extraction of groundwater or fossil fuels. So local variations can also happen because the patterns of the ocean currents kind of shift where most of the water is in the ocean basin. The California coast in general has been seeing sea level rise that's similar to the global average, although there are variations along the California coast. And of course, low-lying areas are more vulnerable to flooding now and in the future. If you're already close to sea level, a rising ocean is going to cause flooding more quickly than if you're up on a bluff or a hill. There are a lot of implications to sea level rise, which are often highlighted when we observe the king tides. Some of these include changes to or destruction of habitat, like wetlands and beaches. They also include increasing barriers to public access to public lands. Seaward of the mean high tide line, the state owns the beach in trust for the benefit, use, and enjoyment of the public. These are called public trust lands. So what happens as the mean high tide line moves inland with sea level rise? What happens if it's halted by a seawall? What happens if the mean high tide line is now under someone's house? What happens to the public's land? What happens to the private property? These are all obviously less questions of science than they are of policy and community priorities, but they are definitely questions that we need to be grappling with. And I'm presenting them within a context of colonization rather than from an indigenous perspective, which could lead you to different questions and different answers. Human infrastructure is another big topic of concern, since much of it will be impacted by sea level rise in the next few decades. It's important to plan for the future that's coming, especially for things that people depend on for communities to function. If there is extreme melting of ice sheets, which looks increasingly likely, we may see more than 10 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. So that's the basis behind what we're seeing globally and what is projected for the future. Bringing it back to the King Tides project, we're asking the public to take notice of the world around them and the intersection between the ocean and the land for all of those reasons I was talking about and a whole bunch of other reasons that I didn't even get to. So anyone with a smartphone or a digital camera can participate in this community science project. You can go to the King Tides website, which is right here on the screen. And on that website, you can find the time of your local high tide, and you can learn how to upload your photos to the project. You can upload your photos using a form on the website, or you can download an app ahead of time and upload them that way. The directions for both methods are on the website, and the form that you'll use will look the same, whether you do it on the website or on the app. A good thing about the process that we're using is that you don't have to give any personal information or create an account if you don't, you don't have to do that, and you don't even have to give us your name or your email if you don't want to. It is optional to provide an email address, and if you do, you'll get an email from me, and if we have any questions about your photo, we can ask them, but it is not at all required. You're welcome to stay anonymous if you'd like. One thing that is important when you're participating in the King Tides project is that you have location services turned on for your camera. That is generally the default for your phone, but if you're privacy minded, you may have turned that off. So if you can turn it on just for this photograph, that would be very helpful. And if not, or if you have a digital camera that doesn't geotag, just take careful note of exactly where you are when you take your King Tides photos, because we really need that information when we're processing your data, this data that you collected. On the form, it will take in the geotag, but it also has a map there, which you can see, so that if you had to write down where you were taking your photo, you can zoom in really far to put a pin exactly where you were standing, and then we'll get that information. On the King Tides webpage, we have a Google map where you can quickly find the high tide time near you for each day during the King Tides. The high tide time does vary depending on where you are. On the outer coast, the high tides during the King Tides are going to be early to mid-morning, but as you move farther into the bay, they get to be later morning and early afternoon. If you want to go tide pooling during the extreme low tides that happen on those same days, those will be in the late afternoon on the outer coast. So after you upload your photos, we'll place them on a map of California that everyone can explore and learn from. And this is what it looks like, and it is linked from the King Tides webpage. So you'll see the photo is the most prominent thing, and then there's a smaller map on the side that you can zoom in or out of. You can scroll through photos where it says locations, there's little arrows, or you can zoom in and click on a pin and pull up the photo that's in the location you're interested in. So we work as fast as we can to process your photos as you upload them. We're trying to do some quality control to make sure we have the correct location before we put it on this map. But usually we get most of them done that same day, or it can take a little bit longer, but we do try to get them done the same day. And so you can check, you can be checking the photo map to see when your photos get uploaded. The little white box that's there on the left is information that you yourself have inputted when you uploaded your photo. So, and that can include optional description. If you want to, you can describe the weather or animal behaviors that you see, or people behaviors, or your reflection on how it's different than what you're used to during a King Tide in this location. If you do include your email, don't worry, that will not be posted publicly. We only use that to communicate about King Tides. And if you're wondering, all the photos here were taken by members of the public, and they're all Bay Area King Tides photos. And I think they may all be from last season. So here are some tips for when you're taking your King Tides photos. First, and most important, please always be aware of your surroundings and be safe. Do not put yourself in harm's way for a photo. Always keep an eye on the ocean and stay out of the waves. Another thing to be careful of is that shorebirds may be much higher up the shore than usual. So you want to make sure you're not disturbing them when you're trying to get a photo. Specifically regarding your photos, it often helps to look upshore or downshore rather than straight out at the water, so that we can gauge the height of the water next to something permanent like a bluff or a seawall. A photo that just shows waves rolling onto the sand with nothing else in the picture doesn't provide a lot of helpful information for understanding what we're seeing. King tides photos can also show water under bridges or piers in relation to beach access stairs or flooding on streets and sidewalks. Something that we're seeing more of is water being pushed up through the storm drain system and into the street that way. So it's not just water coming up and over, but water coming up from below. And if you see that happening, it's very helpful to capture that. And this is just one more photo of San Francisco during the last king tides. This is just north of the ferry building, and that walkway does flood when the water's high. So photographing today's extreme high tides gives us a window into the everyday water level of the future. So when you look at a beach or a road that's flooded during king tides, think about what it would be like for the water level to be at least that high every single day. What will it look like during a king tide in 2040 or 2050 when the water level is 1 or 3 feet higher than it is now? What will happen when there's a big winter storm? And what if that happens during a king tide? Here's our web address again. And these, again, are the dates of this season's king tide. So December 23rd and 24th, right around the corner. And then again, January 21st and 22nd. And this is my email. You're welcome to email me with any questions. But I hope that you all can get out there and safely observe and photograph the king tides. And then go back and talk about it with your family and friends and neighbors and coworkers. Talk about what you noticed, what you care about, what you want to protect. Those conversations are a crucial step toward our communities taking urgent action on climate while preparing for the sea level rise that's on its way. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Annie. I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions. If folks want to put some questions in the chat, please feel free and I will go ahead and ask. Well, I have a question first of all. I was wondering where that photo was taken with the folks crossing the street with their shoes in their hands.
Yeah, so that is the, I believe it's called Manzanita Junction. It's Mill Valley where 101 and 1, the exchange is there. And that is a very familiar place, even if you don't live there. If you watch the traffic report in the wintertime, it floods, I think, just about every king tides. And definitely has a big impact on those communities, on people who live in the area, and also commuters. And this is not a Bay Area only project. Our project that we manage is statewide. So from Oregon to Mexico and as far inland as the waterways are tidally influenced. So back into the Delta, we welcome photos, even Sacramento, Stockton. It's not as dramatic a change, but they are definitely seeing a change with the tides. And we are part of an international project. So there are king tides projects in many, many other states and quite a few other countries as well.
Awesome. Thank you. And Michaela's wondering if there's a way folks can find out if there's areas where maybe aren't so popular to take photographs. So there's less duplications.
Yeah, I can't, we don't ask people to pre-register where they're going to go. So I can't guarantee anything, but one thing you can do is go to the website and browse through the recent photo maps, like from the last season, and you will definitely see places that are really popular. And some people want to go to the popular places. So like Pier 14 in San Francisco always floods. That's just to the south of the ferry building. So, don't go there if you if you don't want to take pictures that everybody's already taken. That Mill Valley area, there's the multi-use trail that's very popular. So going, look at the map. There are a lot of places that have not been photographed. Lots of parts of Oakland, lots of parts south of San Francisco on the Bay side, if that's where you are. Sonoma County doesn't get a lot of photos, more rural areas get less photos. So that would be what I would recommend. Check it out and find something that's a little bit blank, and then we will be so grateful for your photos.
Awesome. Yeah. And I will just add here too, we're going to send out a map that we made with some partners of areas in West Oakland and other places where they would like to see photographs. So everyone here today will get a copy of that. And hopefully we see that on the statewide project popping up. And Julia has a question, which is, have you seen California King Tides projects impact policy decisions around sea level rise?
I can't point to a specific policy that was directly driven by King Tides, but there are a lot of agencies that refer to the photos, that use them as visual evidence to justify, what's reality and what's happening out there. And planners who use it to better understand the processes that are happening in the areas that they're planning for. So that's more of what we see. Sometimes if someone wants to get a permit from a permitting agency, they may take a look at King Tides to better understand what happens in that location before they consider approving something. But we'll see, this data is growing, and it's definitely a possibility that we'll have an impact on policy in the future.
Beautiful, thank you. And we have another question, which is, which areas in the state are in particular need for photos?
Anywhere in the state. So the Bay Area gets a lot. I mean, there's certainly places in the Bay Area that don't, but we have a lot of participation in the Bay Area. And I would almost say anywhere else it gets less. So if you want to take a beautiful trip north, the northern counties could use a lot more photos. Like I said, Sonoma County doesn't get as photographed. Mendocino is a little bit better than Sonoma, but still not too active. Heading down to let's see, Monterey's pretty good. But I would say north. If you head north, if you want to go up there and take some great photos for us, that would be fantastic.
Awesome. And that's always a really pretty drive anyway. So that's great. I'm seeing a couple more questions. Let's see. I'm always shocked by how close the water is to the Bay Bridge toll plaza. Yeah, do you know if and I was surprised there wasn't some effort there during the bridge reconstruction. Do you know if Caltrans has any plans for that for sea level rise?
I do not. It's possible our BCDC rep might have more information on that. But you're right. It is, especially if you're going in the carpool lane on a King Tide day, it's shocking. You feel like the water is right there. And if there aren't plans, and I assume that in the not too distant future, there will need to be. So, but maybe we can learn about that later.
Perfect. And I'm going to ask one last question here, which is, let's see, there will be a King Tide event on January 22nd at Cooley Landing on the peninsula. Is that an event part of this project? And maybe you could just talk about projects going on.
I hadn't gotten the the latest details on that enough to put it on the website, but I'll check in with them, because if they're announcing it, then we need to get it on our website. I have been in conversation with them. And there are also some others that aren't yet on the site. The Exploratorium is going to do some programming as well. But we partner with local organizations all over the state who hold on the ground, in person, get to know your local community shoreline and the situation there events. So we do have some of those on the website, and I really encourage you to connect with the folks in your community, because they can help you understand, and you can help them understand what the issues are that are impacting you locally. But thank you for sharing that.
Awesome. Thanks, Annie, so much. Unfortunately, we have to move on from this question and answer period, but thank you so much for your presentation. It was awesome. And we're going to go ahead and let me introduce our next speaker. Ellen Plain is a scientist with the San Francisco Estuary Institute, specializing in tidal wetland restoration and sea level rise adaptation planning. Experience in geospatial analysis and shoreline processes, Ellen has contributed to the development of multiple collaborative landscape visioning efforts, including the Sonoma Creek Bayland strategy and the Sunnyvale Shoreline Resilience Vision. Ellen's work at SFEI's Resilient Landscapes program is focused on planning for multiple benefits, including nature-based solutions for wastewater treatment and sea level rise adaptation. She also has been a leader in mapping and investigating the impacts of sea level rise on shallow groundwater in the Bay Area. And Ellen, I'm going to pass it to you.
Thank you very much, Danny. And thanks, Annie, as well for that great presentation. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Everybody see that okay?
Looks great.
Okay, thank you. So my presentation today is going to be focused less specifically on the king tides and more focused on sort of what the adaptation challenges and opportunities we're facing here in San Francisco Bay look like in the context of sea level rise. So as you all know, our region faces threats from multiple natural hazards. So looking at this map here, which is from SPUR, which overlays a variety of natural hazards, the key ones that we always tend to think about here in the Bay Area are earthquakes, floods, and wildfires. And looking at all three of these things overlaid on top of each other, you can see there aren't that many places in the Bay Area that aren't likely to be impacted by at least one of these hazards. And so adaptation becomes a really important conversation. We know we're going to keep living in these areas, and that there are species and habitats out in the Bay that are going to keep living in these areas. And we know that we're facing, potentially a lot of sea level rise through the end of this century and beyond, as Annie was explaining. And so, adaptation becomes a really important conversation in that context. So I'll speak a little bit about a few of the things that I see as contributing to the adaptation challenge here in the Bay Area. And I'm focused specifically on the issue of sea level rise. So the first issue that we're facing is from the history of development in the Bay Area. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. The second issue is that we have a lot of land along the shoreline that's already below sea level. The third is that there are multiple sources of flooding that we need to deal with. So we have flooding coming from multiple angles. The fourth is the history of inequality in this area. And the fifth is what I call many cooks in the kitchen, or all the different folks who are looking at shoreline adaptation planning and how we can think better about how to integrate some of those strategies that people are coming up with. So the first one I mentioned here is development history. And so historically, we've built on top of the baylands being sort of the intertidal areas, intertidal habitats like marshes and mudflats and beaches out in the Bay. And now these areas are starting to sink and flood. And so looking at this photo, this aerial photo here, we're looking at the San Mateo shoreline, looking at Bear Island, Redwood City, and Foster City here. You can see on the left, this is Bear Island, which is a restored tidal marsh. And then you can see Redwood Shores and Foster City here, which are developments that have been built on top of historical marshes. And so, due to the high value of land in this area throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a lot of development pressure that resulted in a lot of development happening in the marshlands, which were not historically valued as they are today. And so that's created a lot of issues for us. And there's all kinds of development that happened, not just residential developments like we're looking at here, but also agricultural, industry, commercial development all along the Bay shoreline. So I'll show a couple maps to illustrate that point a little further. So looking at this map, which shows San Francisco Bay, as well as the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, you can see how extensive marshlands were historically around the margins of the Bay. This is from about 1800. And what we're seeing in red here is the extant tidal marshes that we have today. So the vast majority of those marshlands that used to buffer our shoreline, reduce waves and erosion and spread out floodwaters have been lost, meaning that our shorelines are more directly impacted by waves, like in some of those photos that were shown in the last presentation. This is a cool historical photograph from 1952 that I think illustrates some of the development in how some of the development in the marshes really occurred. So I think that's interesting to look at. We're looking at Corte Madera, which is a town in Marin County. And you can see how some of this development was done. So this upper circle that we're looking at here, a lagoon has been dredged out of the marsh, and that material has been brought up on the sides to allow housing development along there. In this development down here, you can see material has actually been scraped off the side of the hill and placed on top of the marsh to build a housing development there. So those are two examples of ways development occurred in the marshes. Another big one was to build dikes or levees, basically a big pile of dirt around a marsh, and then to drain the inside. And so then you end up with a lower lying area surrounded by levees on the outside. So ultimately, you can see a lot of area was affected by development in the historical baylands. So you see the historical map on the left side, and here what that marshland was converted into. And so you can see in the North Bay up here in orange, a lot of that marshland was diked and drained for agricultural purposes. In the Central Bay, it's mostly for development, so industrial, commercial, residential type development. And in the South Bay, most of those marshlands were converted for use as salt ponds. So salt, to evaporate salt for commercial purposes. And a lot of those South Bay salt ponds now are in the process of being restored back to tidal marshes. So this another issue that we have as a result of the first issue is land below sea level. And so we have subsided areas that are protected by levees. So this is a photo here from the North Bay, from Tubbs Island, that I took during a king tide, that shows how much higher the bay is on the right side compared to the ground elevation on the left side. And you can see how this creates vulnerability, right? Because as soon as sea level reaches high enough, it can overtop that levee, cause flooding behind. It can break through the levee, cause a breach. And it also creates a lot of issues for us in terms of managing floodwaters inside of the levee. So if we have, groundwater inside the levee, we have rainfall coming down inside there. It creates a lot more vulnerabilities in terms of trying to get that water out to the bay, especially when water levels are rising higher in the bay. Another issue we have is the history of inequality. So we're looking at a redlining map here of Oakland. Redlining in the Bay Area forced historically marginalized communities to live in some of the lowest lying areas that flood the most regularly. So you can see here how the history of racist housing practices aligns with some of the vulnerabilities that we have from climate change. And so unlike in some other cities where you see the most wealthy folks with the most power living along the shoreline, that's not always the case in the Bay Area. And in fact, many of the most marginalized communities are living in areas that are built on historical baylands, on that fill material, like in those maps that I was showing before. And the compounding issue is that a lot of those same areas are historically industrial areas that have a lot of contaminants in the soil due to that sort of legacy of shipbuilding and other high contaminant industries. And that's another sort of compounding issue with sea level rise, because sea level rise can mobilize some of those soil contaminants and cause impacts to public health as well as the environment. And so these are some of the big challenges that we're facing in undoing some of those historical harms and making sure that sea level rise adaptation strategies are equitable and focus on those communities that are most vulnerable. Another issue that we have is water coming from all directions. So this photo you're seeing here is similar to one of the ones that was shown in the last presentation, showing water bubbling up from below. In some places, the water that you're seeing bubbling up from below during king tide may be because the storm drains are experiencing backflow. So there's seawater coming up through the storm drains. In other cases, what you're actually seeing is groundwater. And so during a king tide, as sea levels rise, groundwater is going to seep more and more into our storm drain systems as well as our sewer drain systems through cracks. It's called infiltration. And then eventually that can bubble up from below as well and cause groundwater emergence flooding like you're seeing in the photo. So sea level rise is only one part of the problem here. We also need to be thinking about increased precipitation, which is likely to come in more intense storm events like atmospheric rivers in the future, and also rising groundwater. So here's sort of a cartoon that shows the multiple sources of flooding. So the one that we typically think about is that sea level rise coming in from the bay, but we also need to be thinking about rainfall coming down from below, the runoff coming down from the watersheds, and then groundwater coming up from below. So it creates quite a complex problem to think about solving some of these flooding challenges. I just want to touch a little bit more about rising groundwater since it's an area of interest for me. I'm currently working on an effort with some partners, including at Pathways Climate Institute in UC Berkeley, to develop some better maps of shallow groundwater in the Bay Area. And we're looking at one of those draft maps for San Francisco. And you can see sort of the extent of shallow groundwater in this area. We're concerned about groundwater rise for a variety of reasons. One is emergence flooding, like I mentioned before, but also we're concerned about impacts that will happen before groundwater rises above the ground surface. And that includes impacts to underground infrastructure, like storm drains and sewer drains, impacts to building foundations, potential for increased liquefaction risk, contamination, mobilization of contaminants. There's a whole range of things. And so one thing that we're focused on now is really trying to develop some better information so that planners have what they need to be able to start working on some adaptation strategies. One reason I wanted to call attention to your map, call your attention to this map though, is that if you overlay the historical baylands that I was showing before on that shallow groundwater map, you see they line up almost exactly. And so it harkens back to sort of the first point of the history of development really leading to the vulnerability that we see along the San Francisco Bay shoreline today. The fifth issue here is the many cooks in the kitchen. And so, historically jurisdictions have pursued this type of planning separately, but that may not be the most valuable way to approach this issue, especially because, flooding is not going to stop at jurisdictional boundaries. It'll flow across those boundaries. And so there's a real need to work together on this issue. So how are we going to adapt to rising sea levels? It's the million-dollar question, or maybe the multi-billion-dollar question. So one key way that we know we can adapt to sea level rise is through these sort of traditional engineering strategies, including levees and seawalls and bulkheads, like the one that we're looking at here, these more sort of concrete and steel gray infrastructure style strategies. And that certainly will be a part of the solution, but that doesn't need to be the only solution. So another thing that we can think about is nature-based adaptation. And the way we define that is actions that harness biodiversity and ecosystem services to reduce vulnerability and build resilience to climate change. And there's a whole variety of nature-based adaptation solutions that can be used to adapt to a whole variety of climate threats. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot. But when we're thinking about nature-based adaptation for the San Francisco Bay shoreline, there's a limited set of options of what's appropriate and useful here. Here's a few of those options that we have available to us here. So in some places, we may be able to restore eelgrass beds, oyster reefs, mud flats, tidal marshes, and then some new ideas and strategies like ecotone levees, which essentially are shallow slopes that can be built bayward of a more traditional flood risk management levee that can reduce wave erosion of the levee and also provide some key habitat benefits, create more sort of a transitional gradual slope from the levee down to the marsh. So those are a few examples. And when we're thinking about these nature-based adaptation strategies, the reasons that we're interested in them is that they not only provide flood protection benefits, but they can also provide other benefits, including providing habitat for wildlife. They can improve water quality, sequester carbon, some of them provide recreational opportunities. And so there are other reasons to try to incorporate these into projects as much as possible. I do want to mention, though, that they're not sort of an end-all be-all. Many of these strategies can help sort of buffer the shoreline from flooding, sort of slow down those waves like I've been talking about, but they don't necessarily provide the same level of protection as some of those engineered strategies. And that's why some hybrid gray-green solutions are likely to be a key piece of the puzzle here. So I'm showing a photo here from the Sears Point restoration project, where a levee was built to protect the rail line behind the restoration. We're looking at the ecotone levee here, that shallow slope I was talking about, and that connects down into the actively restoring tidal marsh. So that's an example of putting together some of these gray and green options. I did want to mention SFEI's Adaptation Atlas, which many of you may have heard about before. But that's sort of a seminal document for us at SFEI that we're using to guide our work on nature-based adaptation around the Bay. The Adaptation Atlas serves two key purposes. The first is to delineate logical sea level rise planning units for San Francisco Bay that are based on physical characteristics of the shoreline as opposed to jurisdictional boundaries. And the second is to identify areas that are suitable for those various types of nature-based adaptation that I talked about, so that we can make sure that projects are going in the ground in places that really make sense from a biological and physical perspective. You can find out more about the Adaptation Atlas. There's a cool story map and lots of other things to explore at adaptationatlas.sfei.org. And then I'll just spend the last part of my presentation giving some examples of how we're applying the Adaptation Atlas around the Bay. That document was released in 2019, so 3 years ago. And since then, we've been doing a lot of work to try to apply some of the lessons from the Atlas by working with communities around the Bay. So I'll give 3 examples, sort of one touching on each area of the Bay. So we talked about how in the North Bay, a lot of the baylands have been converted for agriculture, in the Central Bay for development, in the South Bay for salt ponds. And that really sort of affects the way we think about adaptation. So in the North Bay, one of the projects that we've worked on is the Sonoma Creek Bayland strategy. And so up here you see there's these extensive agricultural lands that have been diked off and separated from the bay for many, many years. But now a lot of the landowners up there are dealing with flooding on a more and more regular basis. And so they're sort of looking to get out of sort of a untenable situation and sell their land. And so that creates a real opportunity to reconnect a huge part of this landscape with San Pablo Bay and restore some of those natural processes that historically existed in this area. And so you can see in the image on the right, some sort of what our vision that we came up with partners. This is a project led by Sonoma Land Trust of ways that we can preserve as much of the existing marsh as possible while reconnecting natural processes, including reconnecting to the tides and also reconnecting to watersheds so that as sea levels rise higher, those marshes can actually migrate upland and inland and naturally sort of regenerate and adapt to rising sea levels. So that's one example from the North Bay. From the Central Bay, an example is this effort that we've been working on with the San Leandro Bay Oakland Alameda Estuary Adaptation Working Group, kind of a mouthful. But that group is really a great example of a working group that's working across jurisdictional boundaries to try to develop some solutions for rising sea levels. And so we worked on a report for that area showing how adaptation strategies might be woven together into what we call an adaptation pathway, with each action sort of leading to the next over time. And then I just wanted to call back, since this is webinar focused specifically on king tides. Here's a picture of the Doolittle Drive, which is within the San Leandro area that we were focused on. So this is sort of near the Oakland airport. Here's a photo I found while I was working on this project from the California King Tides project. And that became really useful because one of the things we were looking at when we were developing these adaptation pathways is the key thresholds where actions need to take place in terms of adaptation. And so I was trying to map out, how the road elevation compared with these various water levels over time, and being able to look through the California King Tides project photos and reference back helped sort of ground truth and make sure that the thresholds that I was coming up with for this report were on track with what we'd expect based on what we're seeing so far. Another example here from the South Bay is the Sunnyvale Shoreline Resilience Vision. So this was an effort really to bring together a bunch of shoreline stakeholders who are all pursuing their own master planning efforts and see how some of their goals can align. And this is in an area where a lot of big marsh restorations are happening through the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project. And so there's real opportunities here to integrate some of that big restoration effort with some of the shoreline adaptation projects that are happening more at the property owner scale and also at the municipal scale. And so another example of sort of a collaborative process focused on nature-based adaptation, where we brought together some of the lessons learned from the Adaptation Atlas. So just to conclude my presentation, I'll hit on a few key things here that we can adapt if we speed up, because we know we don't have much time before rates of sea level rise start to increase near the latter half of the century. If we design with nature, so instead of always trying to keep the water out and fight against natural processes, we have a real opportunity to integrate natural processes into adaptation by bringing, natural processes like sediment delivery from the watersheds into the way that we think about shoreline adaptation planning. If we work across jurisdictions, instead of only staying within the ones that we currently have, if we empower and center communities who are going to be most impacted by sea level rise, and also if we add more tools to our toolbox. So thinking outside the box and being creative as much as we can is likely to lead to better adaptation solutions. So I think I have just my contact information, but I think I'll stop there and ask if there are any questions.
Thanks so much, Ellen. Yeah, we have some really good questions. Let me scroll back up in the chat. The first one is from, let's see here. The first one is from Jeannie, who asked, do any of the 3 Bay Area airports, SF, Oakland, San Jose, currently have any flooding from king tides?
That's a good question. So I don't know as much about the San Jose airport. Both the San Francisco airport and the Oakland airport are built out into the bay, and they have levees surrounding them. And because they are critical infrastructure, they have been pretty proactive in raising those levees. And so actually with that San Leandro OLU working group that I was mentioning, I took a field trip out to the Oakland airport recently to see their recently raised perimeter dike, which has, I think they recently raised it by several feet in anticipation of more sea level rise. That being said, they also have to manage water inside the levee, as I was mentioning before, from rainfall and from rising groundwater. And so they have existing pump stations to manage that water from the inside of the levee. But certainly, adaptation is going to be a challenge for both of those areas, and something that people are certainly actively thinking about already.
Perfect. Thank you so much. The next question comes from Lisa, and they're wondering where or what the workforce could look like to do some of these nature-based solutions. If you could speak on that.
Yeah, what the workforce will look like. Okay. I think it's a great question. There is a lot more funding at the state level and at the national level coming in right now to think about nature-based adaptation. I think we've yet to see how that will translate into, on the ground jobs and action. But certainly there will be more work coming down the pipeline. When it comes down to actually implementing some of these solutions, it is a lot of more construction type jobs, earth moving, moving sediment around, building levees. But there's also, plenty of habitat restoration jobs in terms of working in plant nurseries and raising up enough seedlings to be able to plant in, transitional habitats at the back of recently restored marshes, that kind of thing. So yeah, I'm not sure if that totally answered the question, but those are some thoughts.
That sounds good to me. That sounds great. Karen wants to know if you could speak a little bit on how to deal with the too many cooks in the kitchen issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just sort of breezed through this, but that's a really big part of the adaptation atlas, is the delineation of what we call operational landscape units. And these are really sort of ways of thinking about the shoreline that are more focused on the physical landscape. So instead of thinking about city boundaries, we think more about watershed boundaries, for instance. And that means that sort of the decisions that we make in one part of the operational landscape unit are likely to have an impact within that unit more than it will on the next unit over. And so there are 30 of them that have been identified for the Bay. So it's sort of more than the number of counties, less than the number of cities. And we think it's a sort of a good structure in terms of bringing together the right stakeholders. And so that San Leandro example that I gave you, within the San Leandro operational landscape unit, which is in the cities of Oakland and Alameda, they've actually already coalesced as a group, which includes the cities, it includes some regional agencies, it includes community-based organizations and members of the local area who live there, a whole variety of folks who are interested in shoreline adaptation in that area. And so we're hoping we'll see more groups like that start to coalesce in these groups that cross some of those jurisdictional boundaries, so that they can start to share ideas and develop shoreline adaptation plans that work more on that level instead of at the city level.
Perfect. And I think we have time for one more question, if that's okay. Michael asks, what effect does sea level rise have on shoreline restoration projects?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's been a lot of restoration projects that have already occurred. So restoring some of those baylands that were historically filled or diked and disconnected from the tides back to tidal marshes. And one thing that we're concerned about is, sea level rise is really, the rate of sea level rise is projected to increase a lot in the latter half of this century. And so it's going to be difficult for some of those marshes to keep up with sea level rise, as we call it, to accrete enough sediment to maintain a vegetated marsh in the context of these really rapidly rising sea levels. And so we may see what's called marsh drowning start to occur in some of those areas. And so for the older restorations that have already reached a higher elevation, they're in a better position to be able to keep up with rising rates of sea level rise. But for some of those ones that were restored more recently and maybe still are below marsh elevations, or maybe don't have a good source of sediment coming into them, it's going to be a challenge for some of those restoration projects to keep up with sea level rise. So certainly something that we're thinking about as we think about some adaptation actions around the shoreline.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I don't think we have time for any more questions. But thank you, Ellen, so much for your wonderful presentation. It was fantastic. And yeah, really appreciate it.
Thanks, Danny.
Okay, let me spotlight. All right, and now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our final speaker of the night. Phoenix Love Armenta is the Senior Manager of Climate Equity and Community Engagement at the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission. Their work has spanned academia, government, and the nonprofit sector, and they have worked in environmental, racial, and social justice campaigns around the world, including anti-nuclear organizing in Japan and India, homeless advocacy in San Francisco, and multiple civic engagement and political campaigns throughout the Bay Area. They have also worked as a teacher with the Mycelium Youth Network and as the Regional Resilience Manager for the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project. They are the co-founder of the New Leaders Council Oakland, a professional leadership development organization, and the project manager of the Oakland Shoreline Leadership Academy, a pilot project that teaches members of the environmental justice communities to be resident planners. They hold a BA in anthropology from Howard University and an MA in energy and resources from UC Berkeley, with a specialty in environmental justice and social movement theory. All right, Phoenix, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to you.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you so much to Ellen and Annie for those great presentations. Hopefully this will be a good complement to that. I'm going to share screen. Okay, can we see my presentation now? Okay. So I'm going to be talking today about how we can prepare as individuals and as a community for sea level rise as it's coming. So as Danny says, I'm the Senior Manager for Climate Equity and Community Engagement at the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission. I'll say I'm coming to you today from Ohlone Land in Oakland, California. So just a little bit about BCDC. So these three women here, Kay Kerr, Sylvia McLaughlin, and Esther Glick, were actually the founders. They initiated BCDC. They, in the 1960s, were really concerned because the bay was being filled. The fill was a big issue. And so, you know, like developers and various people were just throwing things into the bay and filling it, and then they were developing on top of it. And it's actually shrinking the bay over time. And so that was the BCDC was actually created in order to stop that from happening. We have jurisdiction over the entire bay and on the first 100-foot band shoreline around the bay. So this is a little demonstration of the first 100 feet, what the first 100 feet looks like. And I saw in the chat somebody was asking about jurisdiction and does jurisdiction change with sea level rise, and yes, that is the case with us. So as the bay rises, our jurisdiction is based on the mean high water level, and so as the water rises, then our jurisdiction will expand. Even though traditionally we've been focused in on bay fill and also public access as our main focus, over the past couple of years we have shifted to being one of the central agencies that's dealing with sea level rise in the Bay Area. So I wanted to make my presentation just a little bit interactive. I'm going to share with you a couple of the tools that we have. So this is the Bay Shoreline Flood Explorer. I'm going to switch over here and put this in the chat. Okay, so if you guys want to follow along with me, you can go to this website here, and this is a website where you can go and explore and see if your community is going to be impacted by sea level rise. So I have it all turned up all the way over here, but I'll take this back down. So you can basically explore over here. There's a little band over here that will show you what sea level rise is going to look like at various feet. So this is 1 foot. You can see not a lot affected. There you get up to like 3 feet. See, you can see the Oakland airport's pretty much flooded at that time. Take it a little bit further up. Alameda's getting there. You get to 7 feet. Then we're seeing a lot of flooding happening here. And I live over here in West Oakland. So West Oakland's getting pretty well flooded at that time. And then this goes all the way up to 9 feet, which I believe Annie had said that we're expecting 10 feet by the end of the century. So this is sort of what the situation is going to be like at the end of the century. So this is a fun tool to play with. I want to just see in the chat, like at 9 feet, tell me, is your community affected by sea level rise? Will you be flooded at that time? Kind of phase it out, see the rest of the Bay Area. If you want to put it in the chat, yes or no. And, you know, as Ellen said, it's not just about sea level rise. This is sort of what the projection of the water that's coming in. This doesn't really account for groundwater rise or for what happens or the flooding that happens when you are experiencing like a heavy rain. So this is just sort of like a basic predictor of sea level rise. And it's quite possible that your community, even if it's not on this map being flooded, might be affected by floods just because of those other factors. Let's see, chat and see. Oh, some people are underwater. I've got a lot of yeses. Yeses. Okay, so obviously this is an issue for all of us. So the second one I wanted to look at, put it up here, but we're going to look at toxic sites. So Ellen touched a little bit on toxic sites. There is a public mapping tool called EnviroStore. I will put that into the chat and you guys can check that out again. So what you do for an EnviroStore, you can just put your town in. I'm looking up Oakland, California. And what will pop up is an interactive map of toxic sites in the community. And you can see here in Oakland, we have lots and lots and lots. And I usually do a presentation where I show this map compared to redlining maps. And you can see that's all the neighborhoods that were redlined that are experiencing all of these toxic sites. And then, you know, the reason for that is the red line communities were over time were also zoned to be industrial use. So you have all these old industrial uses that are popping up and leaving these toxic sites in the community. And you can see a lot of these sites are overlapping with the sea level rise that we saw there. So, you know, one of the concerns that we are looking at BCDC is how sea level rise is going to affect these toxic sites. How is it going to move it around? How is it going to bring it into people's communities, into their households? I wanted to just show you a little bit of their interaction of it. So you can click on these dots and it'll show you where the toxic site is and clean. And if you click on that, it will take you to a web page where it will give you more information about the toxic sites. So, you know, here we have like cleanup status, we have the project manager, the address, the regulatory profile, including the type of contaminants. So I want just as a little bit of a interactive thing, everybody can do two things for me, which is that pick on the closest site to your house, wherever that might be. And tell me who is the project manager and what are the potential contaminants of concern in your community. So I'll give folks a few minutes to do that. Again, the project manager and potential contaminants of concern. Barbara Cook. XDD, DTT, okay, Sunshine Cleaners. Okay. So one of the reasons why I want you to put the project manager on there is so that's the person that you can contact to ask what is being done about this contaminant site. So one of the things about government is when you put attention on things, then that is when things start to get focused and get cleaned up. And I happen to know the Department of Toxic Substance Control is putting together a plan for how they're going to start cleaning up these sites. But putting public pressure on them is the way that we get the work done, and community engagement of, you know, checking in with these folks and asking them how these sites are being addressed is kind of, I mean, it's putting pressure on them, but it's also helping them. Like if you can get the information out to you and then you can share it with the community, it can help make this, like, cleaning up these sites a community effort. So I want to give you all the homework, which is to actually reach out to these project managers and just ask them what's being done about the site in the community. And, you know, see if you can get some information about how it's being approached and what's been cleaned up. Okay. Okay. And then the next slide, the next one I'm going to go to, there's one more mapping tool we're going to look at. This is a BCDC mapping tool. It's a community vulnerability and community-based organization directory mapped. So sharing that with you. Thank you all for putting your comments in the chat for me. Appreciate this. So this map shows two things. First, it shows community vulnerability. And we have based our community vulnerability map a lot on census data. If you pick on one of these, you can see what the vulnerability indicators are. So whether they're folks, it has folks who are single parents, people of color, people with no high school degree, limited English proficiency, folks who are not US citizens, if there's a severe housing cost burden, or folks are low income. So you can look here and see if your community is considered a socially vulnerable community. So at this point, we're using this map when we're doing development decisions. When somebody applies for a permit, if they apply for a permit in what we consider to be a moderate to high socially vulnerable community, then that triggers for us that they have to do what we call meaningful community engagement. And so meaningful community engagements means reaching out to the community and letting them know that there's a project that's happening in the neighborhood and that they should come and give comments to it. Embedded in this map is also the community-based organization directory map. So if you click on this icon here, you can do either select or draw mode. So I'm just going to select an area here, and then it'll show you within 2 miles, and you can get a report. And this will give you a report of all of the community-based organizations in our map that operate in your neighborhood. So, you know, this is what, oh, it says unresponsive. Well, oh no, don't do that to me. Okay, well, my computer's being a little jiggy, but when it works right, it'll bring you up a list of community-based organizations in your community. So one of the reasons why we do this is so that we can do community engagement with our permittees. We're also interested in seeing that the greater community uses this as a way of connectivity with each other. So, you know, it's been shown that neighborhoods that are more connected, who know each other, are better resourced for dealing with natural disasters. And, you know, one of the ways in which they can be better connected are through these community-based organizations. So, you know, you can go on this map and you can find out like who's operating your neighborhood, what are the projects that they're coming on. If you happen to be a part of a community-based organization and you see that they're not on their map, up here we have this Contribute Your Community Story, which is a survey that you can fill out that will then add your community-based organization onto these maps. So this map is very much still in the pilot phase, So we would love it if we could get even more community-based organizations reported onto this map, because that's going to make our work even better, more effective. Okay. So that is it for maps. Let's see where I'm at. Okay, so I want to talk to you about Bay Adapt. So this is sort of the answer to how we're dealing with the too many cooks in the kitchen issue. So Bay Adapt's a regional strategy for a rising bay. So we have, over the past 2 years, been working on what we call the Bay Adapt joint platform. So this is a regional consensus-driven strategy that lays out the actions necessary to adapt the Bay Area to rising sea level to protect people and the natural and built environment. So over the past 2 years, we've brought together a team of experts who have come and put together a plan for how we as a region are going to start adapting to sea level rise. And we've put together a strategy, the joint platform. The joint platform includes 9 actions and 26 strategies for how we're going to deal with sea level rise. So that's action 1, collaborate on a one bay vision to adapt to rising sea levels. Action 2, elevate communities to lead. Action 3, broaden public understanding of climate change and science and impacts. Action 4, base plans and projects on the best science, data, and knowledge. Action 5, align local and regional plans into a unified adaptation approach. Action 6, figure out how to fund adaptation. Action 7, we're going to refine and accelerate regulatory approval processes. Action 8, fund and facilitate faster adaptation projects. And Action 9, track and report progress to guide future actions. So we finished that joint platform, and now we're going into the implementation phase of all this, trying to put this all into action. So we've got 3 committees that we're putting together. One is a task force that's going to be made up of elected officials that's going to be working on this. We're going to have an implementation committee that's going to be focused in on the 9 actions in the joint platform and making sure they get put into action. And then the third one is we're planning a shoreline plan advisory group. And this is kind of addressing the too many cooks in the kitchen, because what we're doing is we're taking the next about year and a half, and we're going to be creating a set of guidelines for local jurisdictions on how they should develop their own shoreline plans. So we are actually looking for someone from the Sierra Club. We'd like to invite anyone who's interested to come to sit on this advisory group and to help us to build those guidelines for it. So I'm going to share my email at the end, but if you're interested in participating in this group, then yeah, please contact me. The other part is this, as this project is going on, we're going to be interacting and taking it out, taking our plan out to the community for public comment. And we would love it if people would host community meetings for us to bring us in to talk about what's happening with the shoreline plan. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some things that are happening with some of our partners around sea level rise. So this is a project that I worked on before I came to BCDC, the Oakland Shoreline Leadership Academy. And I'm just gonna go to that. And so the Shoreline Leadership Academy was a 6-month training and planning process where we brought community members and we actually paid them to learn everything there was about shoreline resilience. You can see here, we have the 6 modules that they were learning from. They actually did hands-on work on the shoreline, and then they came up with plans for the shoreline that they could later apply for funding to get it enacted. So right here, the thing I just put in the chat is a link to the curriculum. If you click on this, you can see we have video recordings of all of the trainings. So if you want to go through the Oakland Shoreline Leadership Academy and learn what they learned, that information is all available here. This was funded through a $180,000 grant from Measure AA. And we are looking to replicate this in other places around the Bay Area. So if you know a nonprofit or an agency, or you're part of an agency that would like to do this kind of project, please let me know. We're getting folks set up with Measure AA to apply for grants for this. They're very open to it. So yeah. Another project I worked on with the Mycelium Youth Network, they are hosting a youth leadership council. So these are young high school students who go through and do a participatory action research process in their school, and they decide a project that they're going to do at on site at their school. So I worked at Met West High School. After our year-long process, what the students decided is that they wanted to do a remediation project at their school. Their school is actually a toxic site. And so this semester they are doing research about the site at their school and figuring out ways that they can do like a remediation plan for the toxic site on their campus. And this is a project that is working with the most vulnerable community members. So you know, the folks who are living unhoused in our community are actually going to be the front lines of dealing with sea level rise. They're dealing with it now with all of the rains that have been going on. And so we have, you know, community members who are going out and helping to distribute food, care kits, free store, free massage, free haircuts, and actually giving service to the folks in the community who are unhoused. So just to go into, you know, one more element of it is that funding for projects such as these is coming down the line in like a really big and major way. So it says, you know, Governor Newsom signs a climate action bill, outlines historic $15 billion package to tackle the climate crisis and protect vulnerable communities. So these agencies right here, the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority has Measure AA. They give away $25 million a year for projects, restoration projects along the Bay. The Governor's Office of Planning and Research has what's called ICARP funds. And they're giving away, I think I was talking today, $50 million. And the Ocean Protection Council also has a fairly large pot of money. I think they're saying like $37 million, all for coastal resiliency and climate resiliency. So, you know, if you're working with a nonprofit, these are really great places to go and look for, search for funds for your projects. So just kind of as a review, some of the top 10 things that you can do to prepare for sea level rise, you know, learn about the topic as you're doing today, get to know the members of your community, connect with government. We're asking folks to connect with us, and, you know, also your local government is going to be doing local plans. So work with them, protect the most vulnerable of your community members. As I said, we would looking for people to join the Bay Adapt Advisory Group. We also want people to host community meetings. So that's my presentation. Thank you. That's my contact information. And just want to see if there's any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Phoenix. That was awesome and really appreciated the mapping tool. You going over that was incredible. Yeah, I just want to open up the floor to any questions. Feel free to throw those in the chat. Let's see. I'll give some folks a few minutes to add anything if there's any questions. Well, you did ask folks about potentially joining or sitting on the advisory group. Is that just, should folks email you if they're interested?
Yes, please email me. And just to know that that's going to be going from January until till March of 2024. It's like a 1 meeting a month.
Awesome.
Volunteer options. So I'm working on trying to get together volunteer options. Can you, if you want to email me if you're interested in volunteering, kind of coming up, like the best way to volunteer is just to like get the word out into your community about what's going on. We're going to be we're going to be doing a large community engagement effort over the next year. And so we just want to be able to get out into as many communities as possible and talk to as many people as possible about all of this.
Awesome. Yeah, and looks like Janet is wondering if you could talk more about the Oakland High School project. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Okay, so they spent 1 year where they did a participatory action research. So what they did is they did interviews of their classmates and of local community members about like what were their priorities, and they talked to community experts on a variety of subjects related to climate resilience. And then based out of what they learned, then they made a decision about what they were going to do going forward. So at Met West High School, they talked to a bioremediation expert and also an expert who was working on water. Actually, I'm blanking on what it is. She worked on water rights, yeah, they decided that they were going to spend this next semester doing research about the toxic site at their school. They're doing interviews with the Department of Toxic Substance Control. They're figuring out what are the chemicals that are in their soil. And then they're working with the bioremediation expert to put together a remediation plan. And then the plan is next semester to put that plan into action and actually try to remediate the soil in at their school. And I see somebody wants me to put my email in the chat.
Awesome. I got a direct message that is a question. Also, is that okay if I go ahead and ask you that as well? Okay, perfect. Arthur asks, are you looking for one representative from the Sierra Club for the BCDC advisory group? If so, let's see. Yeah, should we just pick one representative from the Sierra Club to represent the club?
I think we are just looking for one representative, yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. And it looks like we have another question. How about the huge Redwood Life project proposed in Redwood Shores? There's a community group in the shores that is trying to stop it. The current site, to my knowledge, is on a CAP Superfund site. Thoughts?
Oh, I don't know about that. Is it to restore the redwoods?
I actually don't know about that project either. So
yeah,
we'll have to dig into it. But thanks, Mary, for the question. Are there any other questions at this time? Okay, I don't see any more. Thank you, Phoenix, so much for your presentation. It was awesome. Really appreciate it. Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for a really great webinar. Thanks to our great speakers and their presentations, and for all of you for asking really great questions. This program, again, is on behalf of Sierra Club's Bay Alive program, which is so wonderfully funded by a bequest on behalf of the Rohloff Estate. Thank you so much for allowing us to do this work. Just as a reminder that folks who registered for the event tonight will receive an email with a project packet on how to take photos and submit those photos that Annie talked about earlier. It'll also include a link to this program. So if you have family and friends who weren't able to see it tonight, they will be able to watch it in the future. And with that, thank you all so much. I really appreciate everyone being here tonight, especially our speakers. Thank you all so much. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you.